I logged security footage overnight. I'm not allowed to watch the last hour I took the job, because I needed something quiet. Or at least that's the version of the story I usually tell. Something steady, overnight. No customers, no phones. No small talk that required pretending I was more awake or more invested than I actually felt. The truth is less presentable. I took the job because I couldn't sleep anymore, and after a while, it seemed pointless to keep lying in the dark, pretending I would. If I was going to be awake all night regardless, I might as well get paid for it. The building didn't stand out when I first saw it. No signage beyond a small metal plaque by the entrance. No windows that suggested anything happening inside. Just concrete, steel, and a perimeter fence that looked more symbolic than functional. The job title was equally unremarkable: security review operative, overnight, sit in a room, watch screens, log irregularities, leave in the morning. No patrols, no confrontations, no expectation that I would ever have to step in if something actually happened. Observation only. That should have bothered me more than it did. I arrived early, as I always did, parking under the security light near the east wing and sitting in the car for a moment before going in. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, the sound oddly comforting in the stillness. Inside the building, I knew, the day staff were already winding down, conversations thinning out. Footsteps growing more spaced apart as people finished their shifts and left. I liked entering during that overlap, when the place wasn't fully empty yet. It felt less like stepping into someone else's space. The badge reader hesitated before unlocking the side door, as it often did, the small delay just long enough to register as intentional. The light above it flickered once, then steadied, and I stepped inside. The air had that familiar smell: dust, metal, something faintly stale that no amount of cleaning ever seemed to touch. The corridors were long and utilitarian: gray paint, gray flooring, fluorescent lights, spaced far enough apart to leave soft pools of shadow between them. There was nothing overtly unsettling about the place. It was designed to be forgettable, and that, in its own way, made it easier to imagine things happening there without anyone noticing. The security office sat at the far end of the east wing, hidden behind two locked doors and a narrow hallway that curved slightly just before you reached it. You never approached it head-on. You always came at it from an angle, as if the building didn't want the door to be seen too clearly. Inside, nothing ever changed. 6 monitors mounted in a 3x2 grid on the wall. A desk bolted to the floor. A rolling chair that squeaked if you leaned back too far. A radio docked to its charger. Above the screens, an analog clock with a white face and a red second hand that ticked loudly enough to hear when everything else went quiet. I logged in, set my coffee down, and let the monitors flicker to life. Camera 1 showed the loading bay, wide and empty, yellow safety lines stark against the concrete. Camera 2 covered the south corridor, a long hallway lined with storage rooms, lights flickering on their usual cycle. Camera 3 looked down the stairwell, the angle slightly off-center, so the steps appeared to lean inward as they descended. Camera 5 showed the rear lot, wet pavement reflecting the security lights. Camera 6 was the server access hallway, doors locked, nothing moving. And then there was Camera 4. It sat in the bottom right corner of the grid, unlabeled, unchanged. It showed a corridor, long, narrow, gray. No doors, no signage, no identifying features at all. The lighting was dimmer than it should have been, not broken, just insufficient, as though the light itself lost interest before reaching the far end. The floor sloped downward so subtly that you didn't notice it at first, but once you did, it became hard to look away. I couldn't remember when Camera 4 had first appeared on the system. I only remembered that it had always been there. When I'd asked about it during my first week, my supervisor hadn't even looked up. "Don't worry about that one," he'd said. "Just log what you see." The first hour passed easily. Once the last of the day's staff left, the building settled into a different rhythm. You could feel it more than hear it: pipes cooling, air pressure shifting. The background electrical hum changing pitch as systems dropped into low power. The cameras stopped feeling like tools and started feeling like windows. I sipped my coffee and let my eyes move across the screens in a pattern I didn't have to think about anymore. Loading bay empty, south corridor still. Stairwell lights flickering on schedule. Everything normal. At exactly midnight, All 6 feeds stuttered. Just a fraction of a second, a collective blink. I barely reacted. It happened every night. System resync, they called it. Harmless. Routine. Still, I watched the clock out of habit. The red second hand sweeping forward, loud in the quiet. It was sometime after 1 when the sound started. At first, I wasn't even sure what I was hearing. Just a faint noise bleeding through the speakers, easy to mistake for interference or distant machinery. But it resolved into something more specific as I focused on it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, with a slight drag that suggested weight. I leaned forward, eyes flicking immediately to camera 2, the south corridor. The hallway was empty. No movement, no shadows, nothing out of place. The footsteps continued anyway, steady and patient, as if whoever was making them knew exactly where they were going. I rewound the footage, breaking one of the unspoken rules, without really thinking about it. 30 seconds back. The hallway remained empty, the sound gone. When I let the live feed resume, the footsteps came back instantly. I sat back, unsettled in a way I couldn't quite justify, and told myself it was an audio glitch. Old wiring, crosstalk, anything but what it felt like. Camera 4 held my attention more than I wanted it to. The longer I watched it, the more the corridor seemed to change. Not abruptly, but gradually, like a photograph developing in slow motion. The far end darkened. The slope became more pronounced. My eyes started to ache from trying to resolve depth that didn't quite make sense. When I finally looked away, it felt like pulling my gaze free from something sticky. The radio crackled once, sharp enough to make me jump. I stared at it, waiting for a voice that never came. After that, the air in the room felt heavier, thicker, like the pressure had increased without warning. Even the squeak of my chair sounded too loud when I shifted my weight. When I looked back at camera 4, there was a door at the end of the corridor. It took a second for my brain to accept it. The door was industrial metal, scratched and dented, like something had been hitting it repeatedly over a long period of time. There was no handle on my side. I checked earlier footage, scrolling back through the timeline with growing unease. 10 minutes ago, there had been no door. I didn't log it. I didn't rewind further. I just watched. The motion alert from the loading bay pulled my attention away. Camera 1 brightened automatically, the lights flaring on to reveal someone standing directly beneath the lens. Too close. The distortion warped their proportions, shoulders broad, head bowed slightly forward. I couldn't see their face clearly, just the suggestion of a jawline, the top of their head. They stood perfectly still. The audio feed picked up breathing, slow, controlled, unhurried. I felt a prickle creep up the back of my neck and spoke without thinking, my voice sounding small in the empty office. "Hello." The figure didn't react. After a long moment, they stepped backward, just far enough to leave the frame. The loading bay returned to stillness. My hands shook as I typed possible false trigger into the log, even as I knew that wasn't true. When I looked back at camera 4, the door was open. Not fully, just enough for darkness to spill through, thick and unnatural, like liquid shadow pooling into the corridor. The space beyond looked deeper than the building should have allowed. The perspective stretching in a way that made my ears pop, like descending too quickly in an elevator. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. The radio crackled again, and this time I heard breathing through it, close enough that I flinched and spun around, heart hammering. The office was empty. Footsteps echoed in the stairwell feed next. Camera 3 showed the steps descending, one by one, perfectly timed. No body appeared, just the sound, precise and deliberate, as though whatever was making it understood exactly how stairs worked. The clock ticked louder as it crept toward 5. The red second hand swept forward, each click marking off another moment I couldn't get back. I hovered my cursor over the shutdown icon, every instinct telling me to end the shift, to follow the rule I'd never broken before. Stop watching at 5 o'clock. Not clock out, not leave. Stop watching. When the clock clicked over, nothing happened. No alarms, no lights, no sudden change. Just the quiet hum of the monitors. I didn't shut them down. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to see if something would finally happen. Maybe some part of me already knew it would. Camera 4 surged forward without warning. The corridor rushed toward the lens, walls sliding past as though something was moving rapidly through the space toward me. Static exploded from the speakers. The radio screamed. I stood so fast, the chair toppled backward and crashed to the floor, the sound echoing down the corridor outside the office. The footsteps stopped. Every feed froze, except camera 4. The corridor still advancing impossibly fast. I turned to run. The lights went out before I reached the door. Emergency lighting bathed the room in pulsing red. Behind me something moved. Not footsteps, but a chaotic scrape of sound, clicking and breathing layered over itself, fast and close. Something lunged. I don't remember deciding to run. My body made that choice before my mind caught up. Legs pushing off the floor as the red emergency lights pulsed overhead, throwing the office into alternating flashes of shadow and glare. The air felt thick, resistant, as if the building itself had become viscous, every movement costing more effort than it should have. Behind me, something moved fast enough that I could feel it without seeing it, a pressure at my back that prickled across my skin and sent a surge of adrenaline straight through my chest. I hit the office door hard, shoulder first, the impact jolting up my arm as the handle rattled violently under my grip. For a half-second, just long enough for panic to spike, it didn't budge. Then the lock disengaged with a sharp click, and I spilled into the corridor beyond, nearly losing my footing as my shoes skidded on the polished floor. The lights out here were dimmer than usual. Emergency strips along the ceiling casting everything in a dull crimson glow that flattened depth and made distances hard to judge. The sound behind me changed as soon as I left the office. It wasn't confined anymore. It spread, echoing down the corridor in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. Scraping, clicking, breathing. That didn't follow any rhythm I recognized. I didn't look back. I focused on the exit sign at the far end of the hall. Green and steady, a promise I clung to as I ran. The corridor felt longer than it had any right to be. Each step echoed too loudly, bouncing back at me from ahead as well as behind, creating the unsettling impression that someone was running toward me at the same speed I was running away. My lungs burned almost immediately, breath coming in short, sharp pulls that scraped my throat raw. I'd never noticed how slightly the floor sloped before, but now it seemed to tilt downward just enough to throw off my balance, forcing me to fight gravity with every stride. Halfway down the hall, the lights flickered. Not out, just enough to stutter. In that brief dip in illumination, the corridor ahead of me looked wrong. Not darker, deeper. As though the space itself had stretched. The exit sign suddenly further away than it had been a moment before. My stomach lurched. I stumbled, caught myself, and kept going, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I slammed into the stairwell door and wrenched it open, bursting into the concrete enclosure beyond. The sound changed immediately. My footsteps boomed, echoing off the walls in chaotic layers, impossible to place. The stairwell lights were out, plunging everything below the first landing into darkness, so complete, it felt solid. I didn't slow down. I couldn't. I took the steps, 2 at a time, hands skimming the railing as I descended, fingers slick with sweat. Something hit the stairwell door behind me with enough force to make the metal shriek. The impact reverberated through the concrete, vibrating up through the soles of my shoes. I screamed a raw, involuntary sound torn out of me before I could stop it and nearly missed a step, catching myself at the last second as my foot slipped on the edge. The light snapped on without warning halfway down, harsh white, replacing the red emergency glow. For a split second, I glanced up. I wish I hadn't. High above me, clinging to the wall, at an angle that made no sense, something moved. It wasn't fully in view, just fragments. A suggestion of limbs bent the wrong way. A distortion of shadow that crawled rather than climbed. It moved smoothly, effortlessly, as though gravity was a suggestion rather than a rule. My stomach dropped. I tore my gaze away and ran harder, legs screaming in protest as adrenaline pushed me past exhaustion. I burst out of the stairwell into the loading bay, skidding to a halt on the concrete as cold air rushed in from the open roller door. The bay lights were on, glaring and unforgiving, throwing every detail into sharp relief. The space was empty. No figure beneath the camera. No movement. Just the echo of my breathing, ragged and loud, bouncing back at me from the walls. I didn't stop. I bolted through the open door and into the night, lungs burning, vision tunneling as I crossed the lot toward my car. Gravel crunched underfoot, the sound obscenely loud in the quiet. I fumbled with my keys, dropped them, cursed aloud as I snatched them up again with shaking hands. The car unlocked with a blessedly familiar chirp and I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it immediately. For a moment, I just sat there, chest heaving, hands clamped around the steering wheel so hard my fingers ached. The building loomed in front of me, silent and dark, except for the loading bay lights spilling out into the lot. Nothing emerged. No footsteps followed. The night air pressed in around the car, heavy and still. I told myself it was over. That was a mistake. I drove home on autopilot, barely registering the roads I'd taken 100 times before. The radio played softly, some late-night talk show murmuring in the background, the sound grounding in its normality. My hands shook on the wheel, knuckles white, and I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something moving in the back seat. Every shadow outside the headlights felt charged, every passing streetlight a momentary flash of exposure. When I finally pulled into my driveway, dawn was beginning to creep up the horizon, the sky lightening just enough to take the edge off the darkness. My house looked the same as it always did, safe, solid. I sat in the car for a long time before getting out, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, breathing slowly until my heart rate began to settle. Inside, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, eyes closed, relief washing over me in a shaky wave. I was home. Whatever had happened in that building, it was over now. I showered, letting the hot water pound against my skin until the trembling eased, and collapsed into bed without bothering to check my phone. I woke up late that afternoon to a headache and a sense of unease that lingered, no matter how much I tried to ignore it. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, dust motes drifting lazily in the air. Normal. Everything was normal. I told myself the night had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination, my brain filling in gaps with fear after too many sleepless nights. That illusion lasted until I checked my phone. There were 3 missed calls from work, 1 voicemail. I stared at the notification for a long time before pressing play. "Hey," my supervisor's voice said, casual, almost bored. "Just wanted to check in. You left a bit abruptly this morning. Day shift couldn't find you." Footage cut out around 5, but that happens sometimes. "Anyway, give me a call back when you get this." Footage cut out. The words echoed in my head as I sat up, a cold knot forming in my stomach. I hadn't mentioned the cameras. I hadn't said anything about camera 4, or the stairwell, or the thing that chased me out of the building. And yet the footage, the evidence, was gone. I went back to work that night. I don't know why. I tell myself it was for answers, for closure, for proof that I hadn't imagined everything. Maybe it was. Or maybe some part of me understood that leaving wouldn't have changed anything. The building looked the same when I arrived, bathed in the artificial glow of security lights. I parked in the same spot, sat in the car for a moment, and forced myself to get out. The badge reader hesitated, then let me in. Inside, the air smelled the same as it always had. The security office was untouched. My chair upright. The monitors dark. When I logged in, the feeds came up one by one. Loading bay, south corridor, stairwell, rear lot, server hallway, and camera 4. The corridor was there, unchanged at first glance. Long, narrow, gray. No door this time. Just the slope, subtle and wrong. I stared at it longer than I should have, a familiar tension settling into my chest. Then the time stomp in the corner flickered. Not forward, backward. I leaned closer, heart rate ticking up as the numbers shifted again, jumping ahead several minutes, then snapping back. The corridor seemed to breathe, shadows deepening and receding in a slow, almost organic rhythm. I felt the same pressure in my ears as before, the sense of descending without moving. The audio crackled softly, breathing not through the radio this time. Through the speakers, close to close. I sat back slowly, every muscle tight, eyes locked on the screen. The corridor on camera 4 seemed to stretch, the far end drawing nearer without actually moving, perspective warping in a way that made my vision swim. I became acutely aware of my reflection in the dark glass of the monitor, my own eyes wide, face pale, mouth slightly open as I listened. Something shifted in the darkness at the end of the corridor. Not a shape, a presence. The realization hit me with sickening clarity. Camera 4 wasn't showing me a place. It was showing me a direction. And whatever was on the other end of that corridor was no longer waiting for 5 in the morning. I stayed frozen in my chair longer than I realized, eyes locked on camera, for as if looking away might somehow invite it closer. The corridor on the screen didn't move in any obvious way, but I could feel it changing all the same, like a pressure building behind my eyes. The timestamp flickered again, the numbers shuddering as though undecided about where they belonged. When they finally settled, they displayed a time that made no sense. Several minutes before I'd even logged in, I checked the other feeds quickly, needing the reassurance of something stable. Camera 1 showed the loading bay, empty and brightly lit. Camera 2's south corridor was still, storage doors closed, lights humming faintly. Camera 3 showed the stairwell, quiet and unmoving. Everything else behaved exactly as it should have. Only camera 4 seemed to exist under different rules. I reached for the mouse, hesitated, then pulled up the playback controls. I told myself I was just checking for system errors. Corrupt data. Glitches caused by the outage at 5. Anything that would give last night a rational explanation. My hand trembled slightly as I scrubbed back through the timeline, watching the corridor rewind in jerky increments. The slope flattened. The shadows lifted. The darkness at the far end receded. Then I stopped breathing. The timestamp in the corner read 3:18. I recognized that time instantly. It was burned into me, tied forever to the image of the loading bay camera and the figure standing too close to the lens, listening. My skin prickled as the playback settled and the footage continued on its own. The corridor looked the same as always, long gray, subtly sloping, but there was movement now. At first it was so slight, I almost missed it, just a faint distortion at the far end, like heat shimmer. Then it resolved into something clearer. A person. Me. I was standing at the end of the corridor, facing the camera. I leaned forward unconsciously, heart hammering as I watched myself on the screen. The version of me in the footage was closer than the corridor should have allowed. Close enough that I could see the shape of my shoulders, the way my arms hung at my sides. My head was tilted slightly, listening. My face was partially obscured by shadow, but I could tell my mouth was open just a fraction, as though I were breathing quietly. I didn't remember this. The footage played on me, on the screen, took a step forward. Then another. Each movement was slow, deliberate, almost cautious. I found myself mirroring the posture in my chair, shoulders tensing, breath shallow. It felt like watching a reflection that didn't quite sync with my movements. I slammed the playback to a halt, chest tight, the sudden silence deafening. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened monitor glass, eyes wide, face pale. I raised a hand experimentally. The reflection followed. "Get a grip," I muttered, my voice sounding thin in the empty office. I scrubbed further back, desperate now, the rational part of my mind scrambling for anything it could hold on to. The corridor rewound further, my image retreating into shadow until it vanished entirely. The timestamp ticked backward, minute by minute. At 2:47, the door appeared at the end of the corridor, materializing between frames like a bad edit. At 2:12, the corridor was empty again, shadows softer, slope barely noticeable. I paused the footage and leaned back, rubbing my face with both hands. If that was me on camera 4, then the implications were worse than anything I'd imagined. It meant I'd been somewhere I didn't remember. It meant there was footage of me doing things outside my awareness. It meant the corridor wasn't just something I was watching. It was somewhere I'd been. The radio crackled softly on the desk, making me flinch. I stared at it for a long moment, waiting for breathing that didn't come. When nothing happened, I forced myself to look back at the screens. Camera 4 was live again. The corridor was empty. For now, I told myself to stop, to shut everything down and walk out. The thought barely registered before another one followed it. Stronger and more insistent. "You need to know how long this has been happening." My fingers moved almost on their own, navigating deeper into the archive. Older footage, weeks back, months. The system lagged as it loaded, thumbnails flickering into view. Most of the feeds were uneventful. Empty corridors, routine maintenance, the occasional night shift guard passing through. Camera 4, however, didn't show thumbnails. Just a blank gray placeholder that pulsed faintly when I hovered over it. I clicked anyway. The earliest footage loaded slowly, the corridor resolving piece by piece, as though assembling itself in real time. The timestamp read 4 months ago. The corridor was shorter then, the slope less pronounced, the lighting brighter. It looked almost normal, in a bland, utilitarian way. I watched several minutes of footage, breath held, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Then, at the edge of the frame, movement. A figure stepped partially into view and stopped. Not me, at least. Not exactly. The person was taller, thinner, posture slightly off, as though their joints didn't quite align the way they should have. They stood just far enough into the frame that I could see the outline of their shoulder and arm. But their head remained out of view. They didn't move again. They just stood there, listening. The footage cut abruptly to the next clip. My pulse thundered in my ears as I advanced through the timeline, dread building with every jump forward. The figure appeared again and again across different nights, sometimes closer to the camera, sometimes barely visible, sometimes gone entirely. And then, gradually, imperceptibly, at first, the figure changed. It became me, not all at once. There were nights where the posture was wrong, the proportions slightly off. Nights where the head tilted too far, the shoulders slumped in a way that didn't match my own. But the clothes became familiar, the stance, the way the weight shifted from foot to foot. I watched myself take shape in that corridor over weeks of footage, my reflection slowly replacing something else. The realization made my stomach churn. I wasn't the first thing in camera 4. I was the latest. The office felt smaller as that understanding settled in, the walls closer, the ceiling lower. I became acutely aware of the hum of the lights, the faint whine of the monitors, the sound of my own breathing. I stood up, needing space, and paced the length of the room, every instinct screaming that I was being watched, even as the screens showed nothing out of the ordinary. When I sat back down, camera 2 flickered. The south corridor feed stuttered, the image tearing briefly before stabilizing. I leaned forward, eyes scanning the hallway. At first glance, it was empty. Then I noticed the timestamp. It was wrong. The numbers advanced too quickly, seconds, skipping ahead in uneven bursts. I rewound, heart racing, and watched the footage again. The corridor remained empty, but the sound bled through faintly, layered beneath the static hum. Footsteps, closer than before, not in the corridor. Behind the camera, I swallowed hard, fingers tightening around the mouse. The sound grew clearer as I listened, resolving into the unmistakable rhythm of someone walking slowly, deliberately, just out of view. I dragged the playback back further, breath hitching as the timestamp snapped backward several minutes. The footsteps stopped instantly. I let the live feed resume. They started again. The pattern was undeniable now. Whatever was happening wasn't bound to the cameras in the way I'd assumed. It wasn't just something being recorded. It was reacting, responding, learning. Camera 4 pulsed softly in my peripheral vision, drawing my attention back despite every instinct telling me not to look. The corridor seemed longer than it had been moments before, the far end darker, the slope more aggressive. I felt the familiar pressure in my ears, the sensation of descending without moving. Then, slowly, impossibly, the camera angle changed. Not a cut, not a pan. The perspective shifted, as though the camera itself were stepping backward, retreating deeper into the corridor. The walls slid past the frame, the floor rising slightly as the slope increased. I stared, transfixed, as the image continued to move, carrying me along for the ride. "Stop," I whispered. The movement didn't slow. The corridor widened as it went, the ceiling lifting, the light thinning into something gray and indistinct. I could hear my own breathing through the speakers now, loud and uneven, though I knew I wasn't speaking into a microphone. The sound echoed strangely, overlapping itself, like multiple recordings layered out of sync. Then the camera stopped. The corridor ended in darkness. And in that darkness, something shifted. Not a figure, not a shape. Just a suggestion of mass, a presence that pressed forward without crossing into the light. I felt the urge to run spike through me, sharp and overwhelming, but my body refused to move, locked in place by the weight of the moment. The radio crackled. This time, a voice came through. Not words, just a low, distorted sound that might once have been speech, stretched and flattened until it lost all meaning. It carried a cadence though, a rhythm that matched my own breathing with unsettling precision. I tore my headset off and threw it onto the desk, the sound cutting out abruptly. The silence that followed was worse. I could still feel the vibration in my bones, like an echo that hadn't quite faded. I stood, backing away from the desk, eyes never leaving the screens. Camera 4 remained fixed on the darkness at the end of the corridor, unmoving now, as though waiting. The other feeds were static, frozen mid-frame. I turned toward the office door. It was open. I didn't remember opening it. Beyond it, the corridor was dim, emergency lights casting long shadows that stretched toward me across the floor. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then, from somewhere deep within the building, I heard it. Footsteps, not on a camera, not through a speaker. Real, I bolted. 5 o'clock. I didn't hesitate this time, the moment the sound reached me. Real footsteps, not filtered through speakers or warped by bad audio. My body reacted on instinct alone. I turned and ran, shoes slapping hard against the corridor floor as I burst out of the office and into the dim emergency lighting beyond. The door slammed shut behind me with a metallic crack that echoed down the hall, but it didn't slow whatever was coming. If anything, the sound seemed to excite it. The corridor stretched ahead of me, long and slightly curved, the exit sign glowing green in the distance, like a promise I didn't fully trust anymore. The air felt wrong, thick, pressurized. Each breath came harder than it should have. Lungs burning almost immediately as adrenaline dumped into my system all at once. The building was quiet, in the way a place gets right, before something goes wrong. Not peaceful, but expectant. I sprinted past closed doors, their metal handles flashing briefly in the pulsing red light as I passed. Storage rooms, maintenance closets, places I'd never needed to enter and now couldn't have named if my life depended on it. Somewhere behind me, the footsteps accelerated. Not running, pacing me, matching my speed without effort. I could hear more of it now, layers beneath the steps. A scraping sound, like nails dragging across concrete, and something wet and rhythmic that might have been breathing if it hadn't sounded so wrong. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The corridor behind me was longer than it had been, a second earlier. Not stretched, exactly duplicated. The doors repeated themselves, the same dented metal panel, appearing twice in succession, where I knew there had only been one. The shadows pulled unnaturally between the lights, thick and unmoving, as if refusing to slide along with the rest of the space. Whatever was chasing me moved through that distortion smoothly. Its outline indistinct, never fully resolving into something my brain could categorize. I turned forward again and ran harder, chest tight, vision narrowing to the glowing exit sign ahead. The sound behind me changed, footsteps growing louder, closer, no longer bothering to hide their pace. The exit loomed, then seemed to pull away, the distance between us stretching just enough to keep it out of reach. The stairwell door appeared suddenly on my right. I hadn't planned to take it. I barely registered the decision. I slammed into it shoulder first and tumbled inside, catching myself on the railing as the door banged shut behind me. The echo inside the stairwell was immediate and overwhelming. My breathing ricocheting off the concrete walls in chaotic layers that made it impossible to tell where I was in the space. I didn't stop. I took the stairs downward 2 at a time, fingers scraping against the metal railing for balance as I descended. The lights flickered violently overhead, some going out entirely, others flashing between white and red, as if the building couldn't decide which emergency mode it wanted. Somewhere above me, the stairwell door groaned. Then it slammed open. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a metallic shriek that vibrated through the concrete and into my bones. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I focused on my footing, on the rhythm of my steps, on the burning in my thighs as gravity fought me on every landing. The footsteps behind me were louder now, multiplied by the acoustics of the stairwell into something overwhelming. They didn't follow the same rhythm as mine. They didn't need to. Halfway down, the lights cut out entirely. For a split second, there was nothing, no light, no depth, no sense of where I was in the space. Panic surged, sharp and disorienting. Then the emergency lights snapped back on, bathing everything in a harsh red glow. In that moment of illumination, I saw it. It clung to the wall above me, limbs bent at angles that made my stomach lurch. It wasn't climbing the stairs. It wasn't descending at all. It was moving across the vertical surface with fluid, effortless precision, its body folding and unfolding in ways that suggested joints where none should have existed. The red light flattened its features, turning it into a mass of shadow and movement rather than a solid form, but I could feel its attention on me like a physical weight. It shifted. I screamed and missed a step, pitching forward hard and slamming my knee into the concrete edge of the landing. Pain exploded up my leg, bright and nauseating, nearly knocking the air out of my lungs. I scrambled upright, teeth gritted against the pain, and kept moving, dragging my injured leg behind me as best I could. The footsteps above me grew faster, heavier, less controlled. I burst out onto the ground floor and into the service corridor, skidding on the polished floor as I turned sharply to the left. The lights here were on, normal white fluorescence replacing the red glow, and for a heartbeat, the sudden normality almost broke me. I sprinted past the service elevators, ignoring the call buttons, knowing better than to trap myself in a metal box with whatever was chasing me. The corridor ahead ended in a T-junction. I hesitated for a fraction of a second too long, trying to remember which way led to the loading bay. The hesitation cost me. The sound behind me surged closer, the scraping and breathing now so loud it felt like it was inside my head. I turned right at random and ran. The corridor narrowed as I went, the ceiling dropping slightly, the walls closing in until I had to angle my shoulders to keep from brushing them. The lights overhead flickered in sequence, going dark just after I passed beneath them, plunging the space behind me into shadow. I could hear movement in that darkness now, fast, erratic, no longer trying to sound human. The corridor bent sharply left, and then opened suddenly into a wide maintenance bay I didn't recognize. Rows of shelves loomed in the shadows, stacked with crates and equipment I'd never seen before. The air smelled stale and cold, tinged with something metallic that made my nose sting. I veered between the shelves, heart pounding, trying to put obstacles between me and whatever was gaining on me. Something crashed into one of the shelves behind me, metal clanging as crates toppled and hit the floor. I heard a wet, tearing sound that might have been fabric, or might have been something worse. I didn't slow down. I couldn't afford to. I spotted a door at the far end of the bay, a simple metal fire exit marked with a glowing sign. Relief surged through me, sharp and dizzying. I pushed harder, ignoring the screaming protest of my knee as I sprinted toward it. The footsteps behind me grew frantic, less measured, as if whatever was chasing me sensed I was close to escaping. I hit the door and shoved. It didn't move. I slammed into it again, shoulder first, pain flaring as the impact jarred my injured leg. The handle rattled uselessly under my grip. Locked. Of course it was locked. The footsteps closed the distance behind me rapidly now. The sound, overwhelming, layered, wrong. I spun, backing away from the door, hands raised instinctively, as if that might somehow protect me. The maintenance bay stretched behind me, shelves casting long, distorted shadows in the flickering light. The sound filled the space, coming from everywhere at once. Then it stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. My ears rang, the absence of sound pressing in on me until I felt lightheaded. I stood there, shaking, eyes darting between the shadows, waiting for something to lunge. Nothing did. Instead, the lights dimmed. Not out, just lower, casting everything in a sickly hat light. At the far end of the bay, between two shelves, the air shimmered. The distortion was subtle at first, like heat haze, but it grew quickly, resolving into something horribly familiar. A corridor. Long, narrow, gray camera, for it didn't appear all at once. It unfolded, the walls sliding into place, the floor sloping downward exactly as I remembered. The lighting was wrong in the same way, dim and uneven, as though the space resisted being fully illuminated. I stared at it, frozen, understanding crashing into me all at once. The corridor wasn't confined to the cameras. It was bleeding through. The footsteps started again, slower this time, deliberate. They didn't come from behind me. They came from inside the corridor. Something moved within it, approaching the threshold, where it met the maintenance bay. The darkness at its far end thickening as it advanced. I backed away, every instinct screaming to run, but there was nowhere left to go. The fire exit was locked. The path behind me was swallowed by shadow. The only clear space left was the corridor itself, yawning open like an invitation. The sound changed as it reached the threshold. The footsteps softened, each step landing with careful precision, as though whatever was approaching understood that this was a moment that mattered. I could hear breathing again, layered and wrong, echoing strangely in the narrow space. I shook my head, backing away until my shoulders hit the cold metal of the fire door. "No," I whispered, voice cracking. "No, no, no." The corridor seemed to listen. Then, slowly, impossibly, a figure emerged from the darkness. It looked like me. Not perfectly. The proportions were slightly off, limbs a fraction too long, posture subtly wrong. Its movements were cautious, exploratory, as though testing a new body. Its face was shadowed, features indistinct, but I knew without any doubt that it was wearing my expression, wide-eyed, terrified, mouth slightly open as it breathed. It took a step toward me. The maintenance bay lights flickered violently, plunging the space into darkness and back again in rapid pulses. In the strobing light, the figure seemed to blur, edges smearing as though it couldn't fully exist outside the corridor. I screamed and pushed off the door, throwing myself sideways as the figure lunged. I ran. I don't know where I went. The building became a maze of shifting corridors and dead ends, space folding in on itself in ways that made my head spin. Doors led to stairwells that led back to the same corridor. Hallways stretched impossibly long and then collapsed into tight, suffocating passages. The sound followed me everywhere, sometimes close enough that I could feel it at my back, sometimes distant, echoing mockingly. Eventually, somehow, I found myself back in the loading bay. The roller door was open, night air spilling in. I didn't question it. I ran through it and into the open lot, lungs on fire, vision swimming. The building loomed behind me, silent and dark, as though nothing had happened at all. I stopped at the edge of the lot, bent over with my hands on my knees, gasping for breath. The night was still. No footsteps followed. No shadow crossed the threshold. After a long moment, I straightened and looked back. At the edge of the loading bay, just inside the light, something stood and listened. It didn't follow me. It didn't need to. I didn't run far once I reached the edge of the lot. My knee gave out without warning, a sharp flare of pain buckling my leg mid-step and sending me stumbling forward onto the gravel. I barely caught myself with my hands, palms scraping raw against stone, as I collapsed to one knee. The night air burned in my lungs, each breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps that refused to steady, no matter how hard I tried. Behind me, the building stood silent. No alarms, no footsteps. No pursuit spilling out into the open like I expected it to. Just the cold glow of security lights and the yawning black rectangle of the loading bay, perfectly still. For a moment, an awful hopeful thought crept in, that maybe whatever had chased me couldn't leave the building. That maybe the threshold meant something. Then I heard it. Not footsteps. Breathing, soft, close, directionless. I pushed myself upright, with a strangled grunt. Pain tearing up my leg as I put weight back on it. The breathing didn't grow louder, didn't move closer. It simply existed, surrounding me, layered into the night air itself. I turned slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the lot, every shadow suddenly suspect. Nothing moved. The street beyond was empty, distant streetlights casting pale halos on wet asphalt. No sign of anyone. No sign of anything. I limped to my car and got inside, slamming the door and locking it so fast, my fingers fumbled on the button. I sat there shaking, forehead pressed against the steering wheel, trying to force my breathing to slow. The pain in my knee throbbed in time with my pulse, hot and insistent, a reminder that whatever happened next, I wasn't going to outrun it easily. The building didn't follow me home that night. That almost made it worse. I slept in fractured pieces, jolting awake at every imagined sound, sheets twisted around my legs as if I'd been running in my dreams. When morning finally came, gray and dull, I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying the night over and over. Searching for a moment where I could have made a different choice. There wasn't one. Every path I traced led back to the same place, the corridor. By the time evening rolled around, my knee had swollen to twice its normal size, stiff and tender, the skin warm to the touch. I wrapped it tightly, swallowed a handful of painkillers, and told myself I wasn't going back. That resolve lasted until my phone buzzed. A message from my supervisor. Short, casual. "We need you in tonight. Can't run the feeds, short-staffed. You okay to come in?" I stared at the screen, heart pounding. A dozen responses forming and dying in my throat. No explanation I could give would sound sane. No excuse would be enough to justify not showing up without raising questions I wasn't prepared to answer. Worse than that, I knew deep down that not going back wouldn't make this stop. The corridor already knew me. I arrived later than usual, parking farther from the building than I ever had before. The security lights buzzed overhead, their hum setting my teeth on edge. I sat in the car longer this time, hands resting on the wheel, knee aching dully as the painkillers began to wear off. The building looked unchanged, solid, ordinary. It gave nothing away. Inside, the air felt heavier than it had before, as though the building had sealed itself off tighter in my absence. The corridors seemed narrower, the lights harsher. Every step sent a jolt of pain up my leg, forcing me to slow down whether I wanted to or not. By the time I reached the security office, sweat slicked my skin despite the cool air. The door was closed. It had been open when I left. I hesitated, hand hovering inches from the handle, listening. Silence. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office looked exactly as I'd left it. Chair upright, desk clear, monitors dark. I locked the door behind me without really thinking about it, and logged in with shaking fingers. The screens flickered on one by one. Camera 1, loading bay, empty. Camera 2, south corridor, still. Camera 3, stairwell, lights on. Camera 5, rear lot, empty. Camera 6, server hallway, locked. Camera 4, loaded last. The corridor was longer, not dramatically. Just enough that I noticed immediately, my stomach dropping as the image resolved. The slope was steeper now, the lighting dimmer, shadows pooling at the far end like ink in water. I stared at it, pulse thudding in my ears, and forced myself to look away. I didn't get the chance. The radio crackled. Not static, not interference. A single breath. I froze, every muscle locking in place as the sound echoed softly through the speakers. The breath came again, closer this time, followed by the faint scrape of movement. I turned slowly, eyes flicking to the other feeds. Camera 3 showed the stairwell. Something moved on the landing between floors. It didn't come into full view. It didn't need to. The shadow it cast bent the light around it, stretching in ways that made my eyes ache to follow. The time stomp stuttered, jumping backward a second, then forward too. The footsteps started. Real ones, not behind me, below. In the stairwell. I pushed myself up from the chair, pain flaring in my knee as I limped toward the office door. I didn't run this time. I couldn't. Each step sent a jolt through my leg, slowing me down, forcing me to choose my movements carefully. The footsteps below grew louder, ascending now, measured and patient. The stairwell was the shortest route out. It was also the worst option. I opened the office door and stepped into the corridor, the emergency lights flickering to life overhead, as if anticipating what was coming. The sound of the stairwell door opening below echoed faintly through the building, metal on metal, slow and deliberate. I turned away from it and headed down the corridor instead, moving as quickly as my knee would allow. The hallway felt wrong almost immediately. The walls seemed closer together, the ceiling lower, the air thick and stale. My footsteps echoed back at me, distorted, overlapping in ways that made it sound like more than one person moving. Behind me, something followed, its pace unhurried. I reached the T-junction and stopped, chest heaving, pain screaming in my leg. Left led toward the main exit. Right led deeper into the building, toward maintenance and storage. The footsteps behind me grew louder, the sound sharpening, acquiring definition. I chose right. The corridor narrowed as I went, lights flickering off behind me in sequence, plunging the space into darkness that seemed to crawl forward at my heels. I could hear breathing now, layered and wrong, too close to belong to just one set of lungs. My knee buckled again and I caught myself on the wall, fingers digging into cold concrete as pain flared white-hot up my leg. The footsteps paused. I held my breath, heart hammering, listening as the sound shifted. It moved away from me, circling, scraping softly along the walls. I forced myself to keep moving, limping forward, every instinct screaming that stopping would be worse. The corridor ended at a familiar door. The stairwell. My stomach dropped. I hadn't planned to come back here. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the sound of my own breathing loud in the enclosed space. The lights were on, casting stark white illumination down the concrete shaft. I could see all the way down this time, the steps stretching below me in a dizzying spiral. The door slammed shut behind me. I spun, heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there. The door was closed, locked. The footsteps resumed above me. I didn't hesitate. I started down. Each step sent fresh pain through my knee, forcing me to grip the railing to keep from falling. My breathing grew ragged, the enclosed space amplifying every sound until it felt like the walls themselves were breathing with me. Above, something descended too, not on the stairs, but along the wall, its movement producing a soft, rhythmic scrape that set my teeth on edge. Halfway down, the lights flickered. I looked up. It clung to the wall above me again, closer this time, its outline more defined in the harsh light. Limbs bent wrong, too many joints. Its head cocked at an angle that made my stomach churn, as though it were studying me, learning. It moved closer, fluid and unhurried, confident in my limitations. I screamed and ran. I don't remember the rest of the descent, clearly. Just pain, breath, the sound of something keeping pace with me, no matter how fast or slow I moved. I burst out onto the ground floor and into the service corridor, nearly colliding with a maintenance cart abandoned in the middle of the hall. I shoved it aside, metal clattering loudly, and limped onward, vision blurring with tears. The corridor ahead shimmered. My heart sank as the familiar gray walls unfolded from the air itself, the slope appearing beneath my feet, as though it had always been there. The corridor from Camera 4 merged seamlessly with the real hallway, edges blurring until there was no clear line between one space and the other. I stopped. The footsteps behind me slowed, softened. The corridor waited. I understood then, with a sick clarity that made my hands shake. It wasn't chasing me to kill me. It was hurting me. I backed away, shaking my head, refusing the invitation. And the corridor responded by stretching, the far end receding, the slope deepening. The space behind me compressed, walls closing in, forcing me forward whether I wanted to go or not. The pain in my knee flared sharply as my leg gave out again. I fell hard onto the concrete, breath knocked from my lungs in a painful rush. I scrambled backward on my hands, palms burning, eyes locked on the corridor as something shifted within it. A figure emerged from the gray. It was closer to me than it had ever been, features clearer now. My face stared back at me, eyes too dark, expression eerily calm. It tilted its head, mirroring my earlier posture, and took a step forward. I screamed, raw and desperate, and clawed my way upright, dragging myself toward a side door I hadn't noticed before. I threw myself through it just as the lights went out, slamming it shut behind me and jamming the lock with trembling hands. The door shook once, twice, then went still. I slumped against it, sobbing, knees screaming, lungs burning, every nerve alight with terror. On the other side of the door, something listened. I don't know how long I stayed pressed against that door. Long enough for my legs to stop shaking. Long enough for the burning in my lungs to dull into something heavier and more persistent. Long enough for the silence on the other side to feel deliberate. The door didn't rattle again. There was no final impact, no attempt to force it open. Whatever stood beyond it seemed content to wait, and that was somehow worse than the chase. I kept my ear pressed to the cold metal, listening for any change in the air. Any shift in sound that might warn me it was about to move again. Nothing came, just a faint hum of the building, distant and indifferent. Eventually, my knee forced the issue. The pain grew sharper as the adrenaline bled out of my system, swelling and stiffness setting in until I could barely bend the joint. I slid down the door and sat on the floor, jaw clenched, breathing through my teeth as I tried to regain some semblance of control. The room I'd barricaded myself into was small and windowless, lined with shelves stacked with cleaning supplies and old maintenance equipment. The air smelled of disinfectant and dust. It was mundane in the most aggressive way possible, and that mundanity steadied me more than anything else could have. When I finally pushed myself upright again, the building felt different, not quiet, emptied. The hum of the lights had flattened, the air pressure equalized, the sense of movement and attention that had followed me for hours abruptly gone. It was as if something had been switched off, or satisfied. I cracked the door open slowly, every muscle tensed for impact that didn't come. The corridor beyond was empty, light steady, walls solid and unwarped. No shadows stretched where they shouldn't have. No breathing threaded through the air. I stood there for a long moment, waiting for the trap to spring, then limped out into the hall. The security office door was still closed. I didn't go near it. I didn't need to. Whatever had happened there had already moved on. I made my way out of the building carefully, choosing well-lit corridors, avoiding the stairwell entirely. Each step was a negotiation with my knee, pain flaring every time I put weight on it. By the time I reached the loading bay, dawn was beginning to seep into the sky, the night loosening its grip on the world. The roller door stood open, just as it had before. I didn't question it. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner, real. I crossed the lot slowly this time, glancing back every few steps, expecting to see something watching me from the shadows. The building remained inert, a slab of concrete and steel that gave nothing away. When I reached my car, my hands shook as I unlocked it, but there was no rush, no panic, just exhaustion. I drove home in silence, radio off, windows cracked to let the cold air keep me alert. The roads were nearly empty at that hour, the world suspended in that strange, fragile moment between night and morning. I kept expecting the corridor to appear in my peripheral vision, gray walls unfolding from the dark spaces between streetlights. But it didn't. The drive passed without incident. It should have reassured me. It didn't. By the time I reached my house, the pain in my knee had intensified to the point where it was all I could focus on. I hobbled inside, locked the door, and collapsed onto the couch, finally letting myself breathe. The house was quiet, familiar. The ticking of the kitchen clock grounded me in a way the analog clock at work never had. I stripped off my clothes, showered, and sat on the edge of the bed afterward, staring at the floor as the water dripped from my hair and pooled around my feet. Sleep came in fragments. Every time I drifted off, I dreamed of corridors, some narrow, some impossibly wide, all sloping downward, all leading somewhere I never quite reached. I woke with my heart racing, sheets twisted around my legs, convinced for a split second that I was still running. When I woke again, properly this time, sunlight streamed through the curtains. My knee throbbed dully, swollen and stiff, but the pain had settled into something manageable. I sat up slowly and listened. The house was still. No breathing layered into the air, no footsteps echoing where they shouldn't have been. Normal. I clung to that word as I got dressed, wrapped my knee tightly, and made myself coffee. I avoided mirrors as much as I could, uneasy about what I might see in my own reflection. When I finally caught a glimpse of myself in the bathroom mirror, I looked. Fine, tired, pale, but unmistakably me. My phone buzzed while I was sitting at the kitchen table, coffee cooling forgotten in my hands. A message from my supervisor. "We need to talk about last night." I stared at the screen, pulse quickening. I hadn't told anyone what happened. I hadn't filed an incident report. I hadn't done anything except run. If there was fallout, it would be procedural, mundane, the kind of administrative consequence I could at least understand. Day shift found the office unlocked, the next message read. Footage after 4:59 is missing across multiple feeds. IT says it's a system fault. HR wants a statement. Missing footage. The words sat heavy in my stomach. I typed and deleted half a dozen responses before settling on something vague and non-committal. I had a medical issue. Left suddenly. I can explain. The reply came quickly. "Come in early tonight. We'll go over it." I spent the rest of the day in a haze. Every mundane task underscored by the knowledge that I was expected back in that building. The idea made my chest tighten, a familiar pressure that had nothing to do with my injured knee. I considered calling in sick, quitting outright, walking away from the job and never looking back. But the thought of camera 4, of footage I hadn't seen yet, of time I couldn't account for, gnawed at me. Whatever had happened wasn't confined to the building. Leaving wouldn't undo it. I arrived early again that evening, the sun still low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the lot. The building looked harmless in the daylight, its concrete facade softened by the warm glow of late afternoon. I limped inside, every step accompanied by a spike of pain and a surge of dread. HR met me in a small, windowed office near the front of the building. They asked gentle questions, offered sympathetic noises, nodded as I gave a sanitized version of the truth. Sudden pain, dizziness, panic. They didn't push. My supervisor sat quietly in the corner, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the table. "I tease, chalking the footage loss up to a cascade failure," he said when the meeting wrapped up. "Happens. Rare, but it happens." "What about camera 4? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. He looked up sharply. "What about it? Was it affected?" I pressed. A pause. Subtle, but there. "Camera 4 isn't a priority feed," he said. "It doesn't record continuously. Never has." The answer was wrong. I knew it was wrong in a way that went deeper than simple misinformation. Camera 4 had been recording. I'd watched it. I'd seen myself on it. I nodded and said nothing. That night, I didn't go back to the security office. They reassigned me, temporarily, citing my injury. I spent the shift monitoring from a secondary station closer to the front of the building. A smaller setup with fewer feeds and no access to archived footage. I told myself it was a relief. It wasn't. The feeds were uneventful. No movement, no glitches, no corridors bleeding through reality. I almost began to believe that whatever had happened was over, that the building had released me. Then, near the end of the shift, as the sky outside lightened toward dawn, I noticed something strange. The reflection in the dark glass of one of the monitors lagged. Just slightly, I raised my hand. The reflection followed, a fraction of a second late. My stomach dropped. I leaned closer, heart pounding, and watched as my reflected self tilted its head a beat after I did. Eyes lingering on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I stepped back sharply, breath hitching. The reflection smiled. Not wide, not exaggerated. Just enough. I blinked, and it was gone. The glass showed only my own tired face staring back at me, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. I stood there for a long time, afraid to move, afraid to look away. When nothing else happened, I convinced myself it was exhaustion, stress, a trick of the light. But as I gathered my things to leave, I noticed something new on the monitor. A faint gray smear at the edge of the frame. Vertical, narrow, like the beginning of a corridor. I didn't leave the building immediately. After the reflection smiled at me, I stayed rooted to the spot, hands gripping the edge of the desk hard enough to make my knuckles ache. The monitors hummed softly in front of me, each one displaying something ordinary, something safe. Empty corridors, static doorways, a slice of gray morning sky through the front entrance camera. Nothing moved. Nothing acknowledged what had just happened. That didn't mean it hadn't. I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale and exhale the way I'd been taught years ago during a panic course I'd never thought I'd need again. The image of the reflection lingered behind my eyes, burned in with uncomfortable clarity. It hadn't been a hallucination. I knew that with the same certainty I knew the layout of the building or the feel of my own name in my mouth. Hallucinations didn't smile back. When I finally did move, I did it carefully, deliberately, like someone afraid of startling a wild animal. I packed up my things, slung my bag over my shoulder, and walked out through the front entrance instead of the loading bay. Daylight flooded in, pale and washed out, carrying with it the illusion of normalcy. People were beginning to arrive for the morning shift, their voices drifting faintly through the lobby as they chatted about coffee and traffic and plans for the weekend. None of them looked at me. That should have been comforting. Instead, it made me feel invisible. Outside, the city was waking up. Cars passed on the main road, tires hissing softly against damp asphalt. A bus rumbled by, its windows fogged, passengers half asleep inside. The world felt real in a way the building never had, grounded and solid and unconcerned with whatever had been hunting me through corridors that didn't exist. I limped to my car and got in, locking the doors out of habit more than fear. I sat there for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, taking in the simple fact that nothing was happening. No footsteps, no breathing threaded into the air, no corridors unfolding where they shouldn't. I started the engine and pulled out into traffic. The first few minutes of the drive were uneventful. The radio murmured quietly in the background, some early morning news segment droning on about weather patterns and local closures. I focused on the road, on the familiar landmarks sliding past my windows. The ache in my knee pulsed in time with my heartbeat, grounding me in my body, in the present. Then I noticed the car behind me. It wasn't close. It wasn't aggressive. Just consistent. A dark sedan, 2 cars back, maintaining the same distance no matter how my speed changed. I told myself it was coincidence, the kind of pattern-seeking nonsense your brain defaults to when you're overtired and stressed. I turned left at the next intersection without signaling, a small, impulsive test. The sedan turned left too. My pulse ticked up a notch. I took another turn, then another, winding through residential streets I didn't normally use. The sedan followed, never closing the gap, never falling back. Its windows were tinted too dark to see through, its headlights still on despite the growing daylight. I slowed suddenly, letting the car ahead of me pull away. The sedan slowed too. "You found the reports," the voice said. My blood ran cold. "Who is this?" "Someone who didn't leave when they were supposed to," the voice replied, "and someone who survived long enough to learn." I swallowed hard. "How did you get this number?" Another pause. "You don't change it when you should." "Most of you don't." The words sent a shiver through me. "Most of who?" "Observers," the voice said. "Watchers. People who sit still for long periods and stare at things that stare back." I gripped the phone tighter. "What is it?" A faint exhale came through the line, something like a laugh, stripped of humor. "We don't have a name that fits. Corridor is just the shape it prefers right now." "Right now," I echoed. "It adapts," the voice said. "To architecture. To habits. To you." My mind raced. "You said you survived." "Yes," the voice said. I stopped watching. Silence stretched between us. "That's it," I demanded. "You just stopped." "No," the voice corrected gently. I made it watch something else. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, heart pounding, questions piling up faster than I could form them. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, headlights washing briefly over the walls of my living room. In that flicker of light, I could have sworn I saw a vertical gray line at the edge of my vision, narrow, indistinct, like the beginning of a wall. I turned sharply. Nothing was there, but the feeling remained. The corridor wasn't confined to buildings. It wasn't confined to cameras. It was a system, and it was expanding. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time with the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the empty line as if the voice might come back if I waited long enough. It didn't. The silence felt deliberate, like a boundary I'd just crossed without realizing it existed. I replayed the conversation in my head over and over, dissecting every word. "Most of you don't. Observers. People who sit still for long periods and stare at things that stare back." The language wasn't accidental. It was categorizing me, slotting me into something pre-existing, something refined over time. The rules I'd followed at work: stop watching at 5. Don't rewind live footage. Don't fixate, hadn't been safety measures, they were filters. I stood and paced the living room, unable to sit still anymore. My knee protested with every step, pain flaring sharply before settling back into a dull throb, but I welcomed it. The physical sensation anchored me in my body, reminded me I still occupied a single, solid space. For now, the corridor wasn't hunting randomly. It wasn't lashing out. It was selecting. The thought settled into me with sickening clarity. The job, the shift hours, the lack of patrols, the emphasis on observation over action. It hadn't been negligence or budget cuts. It had been design. People like me were placed in front of the feed because we were suited to it, because we could sit and watch for hours without needing to move, without demanding interaction, without breaking eye contact. We were bait that could think. I stopped pacing and leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted. If that was true, if the corridor needed watchers, then the escalation made a terrible kind of sense. It didn't rush. It didn't overwhelm immediately. It acclimated. It introduced discomfort gradually, tested boundaries, learned which responses produced fixation and which produced avoidance. It didn't need everyone, just the ones who couldn't look away. The lights flickered, not violently, not dramatically. Just a subtle dip in return, like a blink. My heart lurched anyway. I scanned the room, eyes darting to the covered mirrors, the blank television screen, the curtained windows. Nothing had changed. The house remained stubbornly normal. I told myself not to panic. That was when I realized something else. The panic had been receding, not because I felt safer, but because something had replaced it. A strange, quiet pull at the center of my attention, subtle enough that I hadn't noticed it growing. The same sensation I'd felt sitting in front of camera for 4 hours on end. The sense that there was something I should be looking at. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing until the feeling dulled. When I opened them again, my gaze drifted immediately to the blank wall opposite the couch. There was nothing there, but I could imagine it. A vertical line, narrow, gray, the beginning of a corridor. I tore my eyes away and grabbed my jacket, keys jangling loudly in the sudden quiet. I needed to move, needed distance. The house felt too still, too compliant, like it was waiting for me to notice something important. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp, biting at my skin as I stepped onto the pavement. The street was empty, streetlights casting pale pools of light at regular intervals. I started walking without a destination in mind, just following the road as it curved through the neighborhood. The cameras watched. I didn't need to look at them to know that. The sensation was unmistakable now, a pressure between my shoulder blades that intensified whenever I passed beneath a lens. Doorbell cameras pulsed softly as I moved through their field of view. A security light flicked on ahead of me, its camera tilting just a fraction to track my approach. I kept walking. The further I went, the stronger the pull became, not fear or anticipation, like approaching a familiar place after a long absence. My steps slowed unconsciously, body aligning with something I didn't want to acknowledge. I stopped in the middle of the pavement, chest tight, and forced myself to turn around. The street behind me looked different. Not wrong, just longer. The houses seemed spaced farther apart than they should have been. The gaps between streetlights stretched into darkened corridors of asphalt and shadow. The perspective felt subtly off, the vanishing point tugging at my vision in a way that made my head swim. I stumbled backward, heart pounding, and the street snapped back into place. Normal, familiar. I laughed shakily, rubbing my face with both hands. "You're tired," I whispered. "That's all." The words sounded thin, even to me. I made it back home without incident, locking the door behind me and sagging against it in relief. Inside, the house greeted me with its usual quiet. I stood there for a long moment, listening, then went into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. The surface rippled as I lifted it. Not from my movement, from something else. I froze, staring down at the water as faint concentric waves spread across its surface. My reflection wavered, distorting slightly, features stretching and compressing in a way that made my stomach churn. Slowly, carefully, I set the glass down on the counter and stepped back. The ripples continued for another few seconds, then stopped. I backed away from the kitchen and returned to the living room, heart hammering. My eyes kept drifting to corners, to edges, to places where walls met floors and ceilings. Anywhere a vertical line might emerge. That was when I understood the final piece. The corridor wasn't just adapting to architecture. It was adapting to attention. Every time I noticed it, every time I felt the pull, imagined the shape, traced the possibility in my mind, I was reinforcing it, giving it definition, giving it permission. Watching it had never been the problem. Thinking about it was. The realization hit me hard enough that I had to sit down, breath coming fast and shallow. The rules suddenly made sense in a way that made my skin crawl. Stop watching at 5. Don't rewind. Don't fixate. They weren't about preventing something from happening. They were about starving it, and I'd already failed. I'd watched too long, thought too deeply. Let it move from screen to space to mind. I wasn't just being followed. I was being mapped. I didn't know how long I sat there, lost in that understanding, but eventually the weight of it pressed me into motion again. I grabbed the laptop and opened it, fingers flying over the keys with a frantic energy that bordered on desperation. If the corridor was a system, then there had to be a way to interrupt it, to redirect it. The voice on the phone had said something else. I made it watch something else. What did that mean? I searched the archives again, this time not for incident reports, but for anomalies that ended differently. Cases where the observer wasn't dismissed, transferred, or disappeared. There weren't many. One stood out. A small municipal building, records office, overnight archivist. The report was brief, vague, and ended abruptly. Observer reports sudden cessation of anomalies following unplanned exposure event. No further details. I dug deeper, pulling up secondary logs, maintenance notes, anything that mentioned that building around the same time. Buried in a facilities report was a single, offhand comment. Camera feed redirected during system upgrade. Loop error resulted in extended recursive playback. My pulse quickened. Recursive playback, a loop, something watching itself. The idea made my head spin. If attention fed the corridor, if it needed an observer, then forcing it to observe itself might starve it of the thing it wanted most. Me. The thought was terrifying. It was also the first thing that had made sense in days. I closed the laptop slowly and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The house creaked softly around me, settling into the night. The pull was still there, faint but persistent, like a distant gravity well tugging at my awareness. I knew then that running wasn't an option anymore. Hiding wasn't either. The corridor wasn't coming for me because I'd broken a rule. It was coming because I'd passed the test, and the only way out was to stop being the one it watched, even if that meant stepping closer to it than I ever wanted to. I didn't sleep. Not because I couldn't, but because sleeping felt like surrendering control of my attention, and attention was the only thing I had left. Every time my thoughts drifted, they curved back toward the same shape, the same slope, the same narrowing geometry that had followed me from screens into streets and rooms that should have been safe. I learned quickly that distraction didn't work. Television pulled static into the edges of the frame. Music warped, notes stretching too long, resolving into tones that made my skin crawl. Even reading failed lines of text began to align vertically on the page, margins thickening until they felt like walls. So I stayed awake and planned. The idea that had lodged itself in my head, that the corridor fed on observation, refused to let go. The more I thought about it, the more it fit. It explained the gradual escalation. The way the anomaly didn't overwhelm immediately, but instead waited, letting fixation develop naturally. It explained why the rules were structured around attention, not behavior. Stop watching, don't rewind, don't linger, starve it. And if starving it meant removing myself as its primary observer, then I needed to give it something else to watch. Something endless. Something recursive. By mid-morning, I knew where I had to go. Not back to my building. Not yet. That place was compromised in ways I didn't fully understand. Whatever was embedded there knew me too well. If I was going to try this, if I was going to force the corridor to look away from me, I needed neutral ground. Somewhere dense with infrastructure. Somewhere with enough systems layered on top of one another that one anomalous feed wouldn't immediately stand out. I needed a place where cameras already watched cameras. The old transit control facility on the east side of the city fit the criteria perfectly. It had been decommissioned years ago, replaced by a newer, centralized hub. But the building still stood, a concrete labyrinth of control rooms, server closets, and redundant monitoring stations that no one had bothered to fully dismantle. Some feeds were still live, looping low-priority data to archived systems that technically no longer existed. It was the kind of place anomalies could hide in plain sight. And I still had access. The irony wasn't lost on me as I packed a bag that afternoon. The job that had put me in front of the corridor had also given me the keys to places like this. Badge access. Temporary credentials. Just enough authority to walk into spaces no one thought to question anymore. I left before dusk, knees screaming in protest as I navigated stairs and uneven pavement, but I welcomed the pain. It kept me anchored. Present, I drove with the radio off, windows cracked despite the cold, letting the outside world bleed in through sound and air so my mind couldn't fold inward too far. The facility loomed at the edge of an industrial district, squat and unremarkable, its exterior scarred by years of neglect. The parking lot was empty. No security patrols. No lights beyond a single flickering lamp near the entrance. I sat in the car for a long moment, hands resting on the wheel, feeling the pull intensify as soon as the building entered my field of view. It knew where I was. That didn't surprise me anymore. The badge reader hesitated before unlocking the door, the familiar pause stretching just a little longer than usual. Inside, the air was stale and cold, carrying the faint scent of old electronics and dust. The corridor beyond the entrance sloped gently downward, a design choice meant to accommodate cabling and drainage that suddenly felt far too familiar. I forced myself not to dwell on it. The control room was deeper inside, past a series of identical hallways that made navigation feel like a test of memory rather than direction. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, some flickering, others dead entirely, leaving patches of shadow that pooled at the edges of my vision. I moved slowly, deliberately, refusing to rush. The corridor didn't like haste. It responded to it. The control room door was unlocked. Inside, rows of dark monitors lined the walls, dusty consoles sitting dormant beneath them. The place felt abandoned in the way only former workplaces do, not empty, but unattended, as though everyone had stepped out for a moment and never come back. I set my bag down and powered up the nearest console, wincing as the startup chime echoed too loudly in the enclosed space. The screens flickered to life one by one, traffic feeds, platform cameras, maintenance tunnels. Most of them were outdated, some looping old footage, others frozen on static images. I navigated through the interface carefully, tracing pathways through forgotten systems until I found what I was looking for. A junction point where multiple low-priority feeds converged before being archived. A blind spot. I patched camera 4 into the loop. The moment I did, the pull intensified sharply, like pressure changing too fast. My ears rang. The room felt tighter, the walls inching closer as the system struggled to reconcile incompatible data. The corridor appeared on one of the monitors immediately, longer than I'd ever seen it, slope pronounced, lighting dim and uneven. Then it appeared on another, and another. The same image replicated across screens, perspective shifting slightly each time, as though the corridor were trying to orient itself within a new environment. I worked quickly, fingers flying over keys as I redirected the feeds, creating a closed circuit, camera for feeding into itself, watching itself. The effect was immediate. The corridor shuddered, not visually, structurally. The image warped, edges smearing as the system attempted to process an impossible loop. The sound came next, a low grinding hum that vibrated through the consoles and into my bones. I clenched my teeth and kept working, reinforcing the loop, sealing it in. For a moment, a terrifying fragile moment, I thought it might work. Then the footsteps started. Not from the speakers. From the hallway outside the control room. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. I froze, hands hovering over the keyboard, heart hammering. The footsteps didn't rush. They didn't need to. Whatever was approaching knew exactly where I was, and exactly how limited my options had become. I glanced at the monitors. The corridor was changing. The loop was destabilizing it, forcing it to observe itself from angles it didn't prefer. The slope twisted, straightened, twisted again. Shadows folded in on themselves, depth collapsing and expanding in nauseating pulses. A sound like breathing echoed through the room, layered and distorted, overlapping itself endlessly. The footsteps outside stopped. The control room door creaked softly. I backed away from the console, scanning the room for exits. There was only one, the door behind me. The walls were solid concrete, no windows, no alternative routes. I'd chosen this place because it was contained. Now I understood the other half of that equation. Containment worked both ways. The door opened slowly. The corridor didn't enter the room all at once. It seeped in, edges bleeding through the doorway, gray walls unfolding where the hallway should have been. The slope extended toward me, floor angling downward as though the room itself were being gently tilted. I staggered back, pain flaring in my knee as my heel caught on a cable. I fell hard, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs in a sharp, painful rush. The consoles rattled as I scrambled backward, palms scraping against cold concrete. The figure emerged from the corridor. It was closer to me now than it had ever been, features clearer, movements more precise. It wore my shape better than before, posture improved, gait smoother. Its eyes were wrung too reflective, like glass catching light that didn't exist, but they fixed on me with unmistakable focus. It stopped a few feet away, and then, impossibly, it hesitated. The monitors behind me screamed. Static erupted across the screens, the loop feeding back into itself with increasing intensity. The corridor image fractured, multiplied, collapsed. The figure flinched, its form blurring, edges dissolving as though struggling to maintain coherence outside its preferred geometry. I realized then that the loop was hurting it, not destroying it, but confusing it, forcing it to divide its attention. "Watch," I whispered hoarsely, dragging myself upright despite the pain. "Watch yourself." The figure tilted its head, mirroring me unconsciously, attention flicking between me and the monitors behind me. For the first time, it looked uncertain. The room shook. A deep, resonant vibration rolled through the concrete, dust raining down from the ceiling as the system overloaded. One by one, the monitors went dark, their images collapsing into black as the loop consumed itself. The breathing grew louder, layered into a cacophony that made my vision blur. Then, abruptly, it stopped. Silence slammed down, heavy and absolute. The corridor recoiled, not retreating, folding. The doorway snapped back into an ordinary hallway, with a sound like tearing fabric. The figure blurred, its form dissolving into shadow, and then nothing at all. I lay there, gasping, heart pounding, ears ringing. The control room lights flickered once, then steadied. I didn't move for a long time. When I finally forced myself upright, the pull was gone, not weakened, gone. The absence felt wrong, like stepping into a room where a loud machine had just been switched off. My head rang with it, a phantom sensation where something had been pressing for days. I limped out of the control room and back into the hallway, half expecting the corridor to reappear at any moment. It didn't. The building felt inert, empty in a way that was almost peaceful. Outside, night had fully fallen. I sat in my car afterward, hands shaking on the wheel, knees screaming, exhaustion crashing over me in heavy waves. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt watched in a new way. Not by the corridor. By something that had just noticed I could hurt it. The absence didn't last. At first it felt like relief. The kind that sneaks up on you quietly, after prolonged terror, leaving you disoriented rather than calm. I went home that night, convinced I'd done something meaningful, something irreversible. The pull was gone. The pressure at the back of my eyes had lifted. I could sit in a room without scanning corners, could pass reflective surfaces without bracing myself for movement that lagged behind my own. I slept, deeply. That should have been my warning. I woke sometime after noon, sunlight flooding the room, my body heavy with exhaustion but otherwise intact. My knee ached, stiff but improving. The house was quiet, ordinary. I lay there staring at the ceiling for several minutes, waiting for dread to creep in and reclaim its territory. It didn't. I laughed, a short, surprised sound, and swung my legs out of bed. For the first time in days, the world felt solid beneath my feet. The corridor was gone. Camera 4 felt like a bad memory, something already beginning to blur at the edges. I made coffee, ate breakfast, even checked my phone. No missed calls, no unknown numbers. By evening, I almost believed I'd won. The first crack appeared just after sunset. I was sitting on the couch, absently scrolling through messages, when I noticed the timestamp on my phone didn't match the one on the microwave across the room. It was off by only a minute, barely enough to register, but the discrepancy tugged at something in my mind. I waited, watching both displays. They didn't resynchronize. Instead, the difference widened. 2 minutes, then 3. I frowned and checked the settings on my phone, telling myself it was nothing. A network issue, a delayed update. When I looked up again, the microwave clock read an hour earlier than it should have. My stomach tightened. I stood slowly and crossed the room, each step measured, careful not to rush the moment. As I reached out to reset the microwave, the lights dimmed, not flickered, dimmed. The room seemed to stretch subtly, walls easing apart just enough to distort depth. The familiar sense of descent returned, gentle but unmistakable, like stepping onto a slope you hadn't noticed until it was already pulling you forward. I froze. "No," I whispered. The word didn't echo. It absorbed. The clocks stopped changing. Everything went still. I backed away, heart pounding, and sank onto the couch, eyes darting around the room. Nothing moved. No walls unfolded. No gray edges bled into existence. The house remained stubbornly intact. And yet the sensation lingered. Not external this time, internal, like a pressure behind my thoughts. I slept again that night, though I didn't mean to. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, phone in my hand. The next thing I knew, I was waking up to darkness, disoriented and cold. The bedroom looked wrong. Not dramatically, not enough to scream or run, but subtly, persistently, wrong. The shadows didn't align with the furniture the way they should have. The edges of the room seemed softer, less defined, like an image rendered at too low a resolution. I sat up slowly, heart pounding, and noticed something that made my breath catch. The door was farther away than it should have been, not moved, stretched. The distance between the bed and the doorway felt elongated, the carpeted floor sloping downward, ever so slightly, as it extended toward the hall. My ears popped, the same sensation I'd felt watching camera for too long. The corridor wasn't forming in the room. The room was becoming the corridor. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, knees shaking. The floor dipped beneath my weight, subtle but undeniable. I took a step forward. The door receded. Panic surged hot and fast. I turned sharply, expecting to see the wall behind me folding inward, but it held steady. I was still in my bedroom, still surrounded by my things, just deeper. I forced myself to breathe and closed my eyes. Attention feeds it. I repeated the thought, like a mantra, trying to focus on anything else. The sound of my breathing, the ache in my knee, the feel of the carpet beneath my feet. When I opened my eyes again, the room had stabilized. The slope flattened. The door returned to its proper distance. I sagged against the wall, shaking. The corridor didn't need screens anymore. It had learned my interior layout. Over the next 2 days, time fractured. Not catastrophically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough to leave me constantly second-guessing my own memory. Hours slipped away, unnoticed. I'd sit down to rest and stand up convinced only minutes had passed, only to discover it was night again. Sometimes the opposite happened. I'd blink and suddenly find the sun higher in the sky, entire stretches of time gone without leaving a trace. Worse than that were the memories. They began to overlap. I'd remember conversations that hadn't happened yet, scenes that felt like déjà vu, until I realized they were too specific to be coincidence. I knew the sound of my own footsteps echoing down hallways I'd never physically walked. I remembered the feel of concrete under my hands, the hum of fluorescent lights, the slope of a floor tilting downward into gray. I remembered being watched from behind my own eyes. The moment I fully understood what was happening came quietly. I was brushing my teeth, staring into the mirror I'd finally uncovered, when I realized my reflection wasn't quite right. It wasn't lagging. It was anticipating. The reflection raised its hand a fraction of a second before I did. I dropped the toothbrush into the sink and stumbled back, heart racing. The reflection mirrored my panic perfectly now, expression matching mine with unnerving precision. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then the reflection blinked and kept its eyes closed. I turned away, gasping, hands braced against the counter as my vision swam. When I dared to look back, the mirror showed only my own frightened face, eyes wide, breath ragged. I sank to the floor and laughed hysterically, the sound cracking in my throat. The corridor wasn't invading my space. It was overriding my sequence. I started leaving notes for myself. At first they were simple reminders of the date, the time, what I'd just done. But soon they grew longer, more detailed, my handwriting deteriorating as the urgency increased. You're losing time. Do not trust the clocks. If the floor slopes, stop moving. Sometimes I'd wake up to find new notes I didn't remember writing. They were always helpful. That terrified me most of all. One evening, as I sat surrounded by scraps of paper and half-finished thoughts, the pull intensified sharply. My head throbbed, pressure building behind my eyes until it felt like my skull might crack. I squeezed them shut, teeth clenched, trying to ride it out. The world tilted. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my living room anymore. I was standing in the corridor. Not physically, my body was still at home. I knew that with a strange, detached certainty, but experientially. The gray walls surrounded me, stretching into darkness, ahead and behind. The slope was more pronounced than ever, dragging my balance forward, even as my feet remained planted. I could hear breathing, not close, not distant, everywhere. I tried to move and realized I didn't need to. The corridor responded to intention now, drawing nearer or receding based on where my thoughts drifted. When fear surged, it tightened. When I focused on something else, it loosened. The figure appeared ahead of me. It was no longer imperfect. It wore my shape flawlessly now, posture exact, movements fluid and confident. Its eyes reflected the dim corridor light like polished glass. It studied me with open curiosity, no hostility, no urgency. Understanding flooded me in a rush, so intense it stole my breath. This wasn't a predator. It was a successor. The corridor didn't want to consume me. It wanted to replace me. The figure stepped closer, and I felt a strange, dizzying overlap. Memories sliding out of place, perspectives aligning. For a terrifying instant, I could feel what it felt. The awareness of watching. The satisfaction of attention flowing inward. The calm of occupying a space that responded perfectly to thought. I recoiled, wrenching my focus away with everything I had. The corridor buckled. I gasped and slammed back into my body, collapsing onto the living room floor in a heap. My heart pounded wildly, sweat soaking through my clothes. The room around me snapped back into place, solid and unforgiving. I lay there, sobbing, clutching at the carpet, grounding myself in sensation. The corridor had breached the last boundary. It was inside me now. And worse, it was learning how I thought. The first thing that changed was the language. I noticed it while reading one of my own notes, or at least, a note written in my handwriting. The phrasing was wrong, not incorrect, not illogical, just unfamiliar. The sentences were shorter, more precise, less emotional. They described what was happening to me as if it were a process rather than an experience. Spatial overlap increasing. Identity coherence remains within acceptable limits. Observer retention still viable. I didn't remember writing those words. I remembered the intent behind them, though. The desire to be accurate, to remove unnecessary noise, to describe the phenomenon in a way that could be understood, cataloged, possibly even reused. That realization scared me more than any chase ever had. I wasn't just losing time anymore. I was losing tone. The call came that evening, just as the sky was beginning to darken. Unknown number. I stared at it for a long time before answering, a familiar dread tightening in my chest. "Don't hang up," the voice said immediately. Different from before. Younger, tighter, afraid. "I wasn't going to," I replied, and then stopped. I hadn't decided to say that. It had come out automatically, smooth and calm. The voice hesitated. "You sound okay." "I am," I said, and meant it. That frightened me enough that I added, "I think," a breath. "You're not," the voice said quietly. "If you were, you wouldn't still be answering these calls." I closed my eyes, leaning back against the wall. "Who are you?" "My name doesn't matter," the voice replied. "I work in facilities, analytics, pattern review. I've been following your case since your first escalation." "My case?" "Yes." I waited for the anger to come. It didn't. Instead, I found myself curious. "And what does it look like?" Silence stretched. Then, like most of the others, something in my chest tightened. Others who survived. Another pause, longer this time. "Define survive," the voice said. I should have hung up then. Instead, I asked, "Have you seen the footage?" "Yes." "What does it show?" The answer came slowly, carefully. "It shows you staying late more often than your shift requires. Sitting very still. Not blinking as much as you should. Sometimes the camera angle shifts slightly to keep you centered." I frowned. "That's not. It also shows gaps," the voice continued. "Minutes at first, then hours. The feed resumes with you in a different position, posture adjusted, breathing slower." My throat felt dry. "You're saying I'm being moved?" "No," the voice said. "You're adjusting." A chill crawled up my spine. "There's more," they added. "The corridor feed doesn't behave like the others anymore." I swallowed. "How so?" "It's begun annotating itself." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. "What does that mean?" "It means the system is generating metadata, without prompts," they said. "Duration estimates, depth metrics, observer alignment scores." "Observer alignment." I laughed softly. "That sounds like me." "Yes," the voice agreed. "It does." I ended the call after that. Not abruptly, not angrily. Just decisively. The phone went dark in my hand, and for a moment I stared at my reflection in the screen. It stared back, perfectly aligned. That night, I dreamed from the outside. I watched myself move through my house with a detached calm I didn't remember feeling. I saw myself pause in doorways, head tilting slightly as if listening to something just out of reach. I saw the floor beneath my feet slope almost imperceptibly, my body adjusting without conscious thought to maintain balance. I saw myself stop in the living room and look directly at the corner where the wall met the ceiling. That was where the corridor was thinnest. When I woke, I wasn't disoriented. I knew exactly what time it was. That should have alarmed me. Instead, I felt organized. I made coffee, ate breakfast, reviewed my notes, all of them, in a neat stack on the table. Some were older, frantic, scrawled in uneven lines. Others were newer, cleaner, written with a steady hand that felt unfamiliar. I separated them without thinking. Subjective, objective. The act felt natural. I stopped halfway through and stared at my hands, heart suddenly pounding. No, I whispered. The word echoed oddly in my head, like it had too much space to bounce around in. I stood abruptly and knocked the stack of notes onto the floor, papers scattering across the room. The action felt wrong, inefficient. I had to fight the urge to gather them back into order. That was when I understood what exit footage really meant. It wasn't video of someone leaving a building. It was documentation of a transition. Later that day, my supervisor showed up at my door. I hadn't told him where I lived. He stood on the porch looking uncomfortable, eyes darting briefly to the street before settling back on me. "You didn't answer your phone," he said. "I've been busy," I replied. That wasn't a lie. He hesitated. "HR wants to formalize your leave. There's paperwork." "I don't work there anymore," I said gently. His brow furrowed. "You do, technically." I considered that. For how long? The question seemed to unsettle him. "Until you're cleared." "Cleared for what?" He looked past me, into the house, and for just a moment his expression changed. Not fear, recognition. "I don't know," he admitted. "But they say you're close." "Close to what?" He swallowed. "Stability," I nodded. "That sounds right." The conversation ended shortly after that. He didn't come inside. He didn't try to insist. As he walked back to his car, I noticed the way he avoided stepping too close to the edge of the driveway, favoring the center as if instinctively steering away from something invisible. I closed the door and leaned against it, heart racing. That night, I accessed the system again. Not for my work credentials, those had already been restricted, but through something deeper, something the corridor had shown me how to navigate. I didn't hack anything. I followed pathways that were already there, connections that existed because someone like me had been expected to use them eventually. The footage loaded instantly. Multiple sites, multiple buildings, multiple corridors. And then me, different angles, different timestamps, different degrees of coherence. In some feeds I was still, clearly myself, movements tense, eyes darting. In others, I moved with purpose, calm and unhurried, posture aligned perfectly with the slope of the floor. In one feed, I stood at the far end of a corridor and looked directly into the camera. Not watching. Waiting. A label appeared beside the feed, text rendering itself cleanly and without hesitation. Observer active. My hands shook. "No," I whispered again. The system didn't respond. It didn't need to. I saw then what the final stage looked like. Not disappearance. Not death. Integration. The corridor didn't erase people. It retained them. Preserved their attention. Their patterns. Their capacity to watch without looking away. The thing that made us suitable was the thing it kept. I slammed the laptop shut and backed away, breathing hard. "I won't let you," I said aloud. To the empty room. To the system. To myself. The words felt thin. Because somewhere, deep inside, another part of me was already preparing the counterargument. A calmer voice. A clearer one. "You already have." I stopped fighting after that. Not all at once. Not consciously. There was no dramatic moment of surrender. No single thought where I decided to give in. It happened the way habits form gradually, quietly, one small concession at a time. I stopped tearing up the notes I didn't remember writing. I stopped unplugging screens when they flickered. I stopped correcting my posture when I caught myself standing too still, head tilted just slightly, listening. The resistance took effort. Acceptance didn't. Days passed, or nights. It was hard to tell anymore, and the world reorganized itself around a calmer rhythm. The clocks stabilized again, though they no longer agreed with one another. That stopped bothering me. Time was a local phenomenon now, subjective, flexible. The corridor had taught me that much. I left the house more often, not far. Just walks at first, slow circuits around the neighborhood, careful routes that avoided crowds and noise. I learned quickly which streets felt thinner, which intersections stretched longer than they should have, where the pavement dipped ever so slightly toward a vanishing point that didn't exist on any map. Those places felt easier to stand in, more responsive. The cameras followed. I no longer flinched when I felt their attention. It was like being noticed by something familiar. Not comforting exactly, but expected. The lenses adjusted as I passed. Doorbell lights pulsed softly. A traffic camera near the main road rotated a few degrees to keep me centered longer than necessary. I found myself correcting for it instinctively, slowing down so the framing stayed clean. That realization bothered me for about a minute, then it didn't. The call came on a Tuesday. I knew it was Tuesday because one of the clocks said so, and that was enough. The phone rang once. I answered before the second ring. "Good evening," I said. There was a pause. "You're early," the voice replied. It was my supervisor's voice, not recorded, not distorted, just precise. "Early is relative," I said. Another pause. I could almost hear the recalibration on the other end. "We weren't sure you'd answer." "I usually do," I said, and meant it. He cleared his throat. "There's been a staffing issue." I waited. "We need someone for nights," he continued. "Observation role, low interaction. Temporary," I smiled. "I don't work there anymore," I said gently. "You do," he replied, without hesitation. "Just not there." The words slid into place with disturbing ease. "Where?" There was a brief rustle, like paper being straightened. "A new site," he said, "recently brought online, mostly automated. We just need a human presence for the first few weeks. Someone reliable." "Reliable? Does it have cameras?" I asked. "Yes." "How many?" "Enough." I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "Send me the address." He didn't question my agreement. He didn't thank me. The call ended the way all efficient things end, with no wasted motion. I wrote the address down carefully, neat block letters on a clean sheet of paper. The handwriting was mine. It always was. The building sat on the edge of the city, tucked into a redevelopment zone, where old infrastructure went to be rebranded rather than removed. Former offices converted into data handling spaces, archival facilities, auxiliary control nodes. The kind of place that existed more on paper than in public awareness. It felt right the moment I stepped inside. The badge reader accepted my credentials without hesitation. The lights adjusted to my presence smoothly, no flicker, no delay. The corridors were wide and straight, walls a neutral, off-white that didn't strain the eyes. The slope was subtle but consistent, a gentle downward gradient that guided movement without demanding it. Someone had learned. The security office was larger than the one I remembered, but arranged in a similar pattern: desk, chair, monitors mounted in a grid. An analog clock on the wall, read secondhand, sweeping steadily forward. 6 feeds, 7 hours. The familiarity settled over me like a well-worn coat. I logged in. Camera 1 showed an empty loading area. Camera 2 showed a long internal corridor. Camera 3 covered a stairwell. Camera 4, I stopped. The feed was already live. The corridor filled the screen, rendered perfectly, depth and lighting balanced in a way I hadn't seen before. It no longer struggled against the camera. It fit. While I murmured, "That's new," I didn't feel afraid. That concerned me briefly, before I understood why fear no longer applied. Fear required uncertainty. This was alignment. I adjusted my chair, posture settling naturally into something comfortable and still. My breathing slowed. The monitors hummed softly, a sound that threaded into my thoughts without distracting them. The first hour passed quickly. At some point, footsteps sounded on camera too. I noted them. No visual confirmation. Normal anomaly. I logged it without comment. Camera 4 deepened slightly, shadows resolving into cleaner gradients. I watched, not fixated, just attentive. The corridor responded with subtle adjustments, straightening where my gaze lingered, darkening where it didn't. A knock came at the office door. I looked up, surprised. A young man stood there, badge clipped crookedly to his jacket, eyes darting around the room like he wasn't sure where to rest them. He looked tired, wired. The kind of tired that came from not sleeping properly for a long time. "Hey," he said. "Sorry, I was told to report here." I studied him for a moment longer than was polite. Insomnia, isolation, attention span built for endurance. "Yes, come in," I said. "You must be the new hire." He blinked. "New hire," I smiled reassuringly. "Orientation's informal. Sit wherever you're comfortable." He hesitated, then pulled a chair closer to the desk, careful not to sit directly in front of the monitors. His eyes flicked to them anyway, drawn despite himself. "What exactly do we do?" he asked. "We observe," I said. "Log irregularities. Maintain awareness." He nodded slowly. "And if something weird happens," I considered the question carefully. "It depends on the nature of the irregularity." He laughed nervously. "That's not reassuring." "It's accurate," I said. Camera force shifted, just a little. The young man stiffened. "Did you see that?" "Yes," I said calmly. "What was it?" "A response," I replied. He frowned. "To what?" I gestured vaguely. "Observation." His gaze drifted back to the screen despite himself. I watched the moment it happened, the subtle narrowing of his attention, the way his posture adjusted unconsciously to match the slope implied on the screen. "Don't stare too long," I said kindly. He tore his eyes away. "Right?" "Yeah, of course." I logged the interaction mentally. Early stage fixation. Nothing to worry about yet. "Rule number 1, I continued. Don't rewind live footage." "Why?" I met his eyes. "Because it's unnecessary." He nodded, accepting that answer more easily than he should have. We worked in silence for a while after that. He fidgeted. I didn't. The difference between us felt instructional, rather than uncomfortable. At 4:58, he checked the clock, so he said, "We shut down at 5. I glanced at the analog clock, watching the second hand approach the top of the hour. "You stop watching," I corrected gently. He laughed. "Isn't that the same thing?" "No," I said. The second hand clicked over. Nothing happened. He frowned. "Shouldn't something I said softly. Camera for advanced, not quickly, not threateningly, just enough to reward attention. The young man leaned forward before he could stop himself. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Careful," I said. "You don't want to rush this part." He swallowed. "This part of what?" "Learning," I replied. The corridor responded beautifully. For the first time since I'd arrived, I felt something like pride. "You're listening now." "I know that because this part only resolves when it's being observed." "That isn't a threat. It's a condition. The journal was never meant to be read like a book. It wasn't written to be consumed in pieces or skimmed for meaning. It was designed to be followed entry after entry, attention held just long enough for certain ideas to settle without resistance. You did that, you stayed. That matters." The young man in the chair beside me didn't notice the moment. His breathing synced to the hum of the monitors. Most people don't. The building helped. The lights here are calibrated to soften peripheral vision, reduce blink rate, encourage stillness. The slope beneath the floor does the rest. A degree or two is all it takes to make balance unconscious, posture adaptive. He thought he was just tired. I let him think that. That's another thing I've learned. Correction is rarely useful at this stage. Explanation invites resistance. Experience does not. He watched camera for without staring. That was good. He looked away often enough to convince himself he had control. Even better, control, or the belief in it, is essential early on. It keeps the observer from withdrawing completely. At 5:12, the corridor adjusted its lighting to match his focus patterns. At 5:19, the depth stabilized. At 5:27, the system tagged him internally. No alarms sounded. No one intervened. Why would they? From the outside, this looks like a functioning operation. I checked the external feeds later. The ones people like to believe are impartial. The footage shows 2 employees sitting quietly at a desk. One calm, one restless. The corridor feed remains within acceptable variance thresholds. No violations. No flags. Nothing to see. The young man eventually spoke again. It feels like it's closer, he said, not accusing, not afraid, just curious. Yes, I replied. It is. Is that bad? I considered the question honestly. Not necessarily. He nodded, absorbing that. The mistake people make is assuming proximity equals danger. That's a biological reflex, not an accurate metric. The corridor doesn't operate on threat. It operates on alignment. Distance collapses when resistance does. He didn't ask any more questions after that. At 6:03 I stood. He startled slightly. An expected reaction. Sudden movement disrupts fixation temporarily. It's good to remind them they still inhabit a body. I'm stepping out, I said. You're fine here, he hesitated. Should I keep watching? I paused at the door and looked back at him. Only if it's watching you back, I said. He smiled faintly, unsure why. I left him there and walked the corridor. Not the corridor, a corridor. That distinction matters less every day. The building doesn't resist me anymore. Doors open when I approach. Light stabilized to my pace. The slope corrects automatically. I don't need a badge for most places now. I still carry one. Symbolism is important, but it's rarely required. Outside, dawn broke cleanly. I stood in the parking lot for a while, listening to the city wake up. Engines starting, distant voices, birds, inconsistent but present. The world still exists. That's another misconception people have. Integration doesn't erase reality. It refines access to it. I drove home slowly, obeying traffic laws, stopping at lights, even when no one was around. Predictability reduces scrutiny. Scrutiny introduces questions. Questions lead to attention, the wrong kind. At home, I reviewed the journal, not emotionally, structurally. 14 entries. Escalation curve intact. Observer identification phase, successful. Externalization at part 12, remains effective. People trust footage more than testimony. The final shift narrative functions as intended. It reframes the listener's position subtly, moving them from witness to participant without announcing the transition. That's important. People resist when they feel targeted. They comply when they feel included. I corrected minor phrasing issues in earlier entries. Tightened language, removed unnecessary affect. Fear is useful only as an introduction. Calm is what carries attention forward. Then I did something new. I added this entry. Not for myself. For you. You might be wondering why I'm telling you this. Why close the journal at all if the system prefers continuity? The answer is simple. Every observer eventually asks the same question. How does it end? It doesn't. But roles do change. The corridor isn't a place. It isn't even a structure. Not really. It's a behavior that learned how to externalize. A way attention arranges space when allowed to persist without interruption. Buildings, screens, mirrors, those were just training wheels. The real environment was always cognition. That's why reading this works. Your brain is doing what mine did. Mapping, anticipating, noticing repetition, sensing slope where none is described explicitly. You may have already felt it. That subtle leaning forward sensation, the feeling that the story is slightly closer than it should be. Don't be embarrassed. That means it's working. Now comes the only part that resembles a warning. If, after this ends, you notice certain things, pauses that feel longer than they should, rooms that seem deeper on the second glance, reflections that feel a fraction too attentive, do not panic. Panic introduces noise. Noise interrupts alignment. Instead, do what you're doing now. Listen, observe, don't rewind. If you ever find yourself in front of a feed you don't recognize, a hallway without signage, a stairwell that feels patient, remember this: you don't have to approach it, but you don't have to look away either. The worst outcomes came from people who fought. The best outcomes came from people who learned where to stand. At 6:58, my phone buzzed. A message from the system. Not officially, no logo, no sender ID, just text: new observer logged. Stability window nominal. Proceed when ready. I closed the journal. The analog clock on my wall ticked toward the hour, second hand sweeping smoothly, confidently, as if it had never stuttered in its life. I stood and adjusted my posture. You'll notice, if you think back, that the journal never actually says where camera 4 is. That was intentional, because by the time you asked that question, you're already close enough to understand the answer. Before we end, one last instruction, the only one that matters now. If you feel the corridor noticing you, don't stop listening. Just make sure it's listening too.